Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to our annual Stukes lecture. This is a lecture series that is supported by the Stukes family, and we're delighted that two of the Stukes family could join us this afternoon. The Stukes lecture brings a distinguished speaker to Erskine, and this time we brought David Grier, who very much belongs in that crowd. I believe, Dr. Grier, that your wife was once a Stukes lecturer.
She was.
So you're trying to get even finally. You're coming up to her level, do you think?
Not yet.
Not yet. Maybe soon. Dr. Grier has expertise in 20th century German history, the Second World War, Nazi Germany in particular. And he has already published one book, and he's working on a second. And that is the subject of his talk today, a nice, cheerful history lecture from Dr. Grier. It's what we've all been expecting, and here it is. So welcome, Dr. Grier.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone in the history department, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here to give the Stukes lecture, and I haven't had a chance to bore any students for 10 months because I'm retired, so I'm really looking forward to this. I want to talk today about somebody probably very few, if any of you, have ever heard of before. This rather relaxed looking fellow here, called Ferdinand Schörner. He is not well known in this country because Schörner never fought the Americans in World War II. He fought almost entirely on the Russian front. There's no book on him in English. I doubt there's more than 5 to 10 pages on any single book in English about this guy. There are 2 books in German. One's awful, the other's okay. I hope to change that, but we'll see. Some of you may justifiably wonder, more than 75 years after the end of the Second World War, with tens of thousands of books on Germany in World War II, if there's no book on this guy yet, he must not be very important. I hope to change your mind about that. Just to let you know where I'm going, I'm going to give a brief summary of Schörner's life or career, and then look at 3 topics for Schörner during the war. The type of commander he was, some of his successes primarily, and then his actions at the very end of the war. And then finally, I want to look at some broader implications of Schörner. Now, I'll have to warn you, usually when somebody starts to wrap things up, it's just going to be a couple of minutes. I've got a 10-minute wrap up, so I'll have you out of here within an hour. It's okay. Schörner was born in Munich in 1892. He was the son of a police official. He served in the First World War and was wounded twice. And, oh dear, technology's already at work. There, well, that's one too many. There we go. He was awarded the Pour le Mérite. This was Prussia's highest honor for bravery. It's like the Congressional Medal of Honor. So he won this medal in the First World War. He remained in the military after World War I and rose very rapidly in the ranks after Hitler came to power in 1933 and carried out a massive expansion of the German army. During World War II, he served on virtually every front except North Africa. He participated in the invasions of Poland, of France, and then of Greece. And then from mid-1941 on, he was exclusively on the Eastern Front. First in the Arctic in the far north, and then as an Army group commander in the southern, northern, and central sectors. And A lot of Americans aren't quite as familiar with the Eastern Front in World War II, but this is really where the war was. We like to think we won the war, and yeah, you could say we beat the Japanese, but it was the Russians that beat the German army. The U.S. suffered somewhere between 300,000 to 400,000 combat deaths in World War II. The Russians alone lost 26 to 28 million. And 80% of all German soldiers killed in World War II died on the Eastern Front. So this was the decisive theater. What have historians had to say about Schörner? They usually devote a sentence or two to him, and it's not very favorable. Hitler's biographer Ian Kershaw referred to Schörner as the most brutal and most Nazified of all commanders, who ordered countless executions for cowardice and desertion. Robert Citino judged Schörner hands down the war's worst general in terms of humane treatment for one's own men. And a staff officer in German Army High Command later wrote of Schörner, hated by the troops, the general had the reputation of being a bloodthirsty monster. Well, historians may not have liked Schörner, but Hitler and other top Nazis did. Schörner was one of only 27 recipients of the Knight's Cross with oak leaf swords and diamonds. Most people have heard of the Iron Cross. That was kind of a lower award. Hitler created the Knight's Cross to be the next level up. And if you did something great after you earned the Knight's Cross, you could be awarded the oak leaves. And if you did something after that, they'd add the swords to it. And if you did something after that, you got diamonds on the oak leaves and the swords. So 27 Germans in World War II got this award, and only 11 were in the army, the rest in the other branches. So this was a very high honor. Hitler also awarded Schörner the Golden Party Badge, which granted Nazi Party membership. Hitler once claimed that the Golden Party Badge should rank higher than any other honor conferred by the state. So he didn't give that out too often. In April 1945, Hitler promoted Schörner to Field Marshal, kind of like a five-star general. He was the last army officer to reach this rank. And in Hitler's political testament, he appointed Schörner commander-in-chief of the army. And this was a post Hitler himself had held since 1941. Hitler respected and honored Schörner and always treated him well, a situation very few generals enjoyed in the last year of the war. Once when Schörner arrived at Hitler's headquarters, the Fuhrer greeted him with the comment, "If I had my way, I would draw and quarter you so I had 4 Schörners." I don't know if that's the most reassuring greeting. And in late 1945, Hitler praised Schörner, claiming, and I quote, "On the entire front, only one man has proven to be a real field strategist. The one who has to endure the worst attacks has the most orderly front, Schörner. With every assignment he was given, Schörner achieved excellent results. Schörner, within a few weeks, made a front out of a mess, and he didn't just build it up, but filled it with a new spirit and held the front." Hitler selected Schörner to be the first head of the Army High Command's National Socialist Leadership Corps. This is a group whose duty was to indoctrinate soldiers with Nazi beliefs. And Hitler once described Schörner ideologically as a fanatic, which was a compliment. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels praised him as more than 100% behind Hitler and referred to him as a great military commander with superb political insight who hanged stragglers from the nearest tree. Near the end of the war, German Air Force Commander-in-Chief Hermann Goering hailed Schörner as the only true general and the only one he trusted. Schörner also enjoyed a cozy relationship with SS leader Heinrich Himmler. Himmler, as head of the SS, was in charge of the concentration and extermination camps, and he was the true architect of the Holocaust. And he and Schörner were big buddies. Schörner embraced Nazi ideology, as evidenced by his own comment that he considered himself a half-SS man. Many of his orders reflect a preoccupation with Nazi ideology, and he insisted that his soldiers must be indoctrinated to stiffen their will to fight. He instructed his men that the conflict in Russia represented a different type of campaign from earlier campaigns in the West, and that the war on the Eastern Front was an ideological struggle, a struggle for existence against a bestial Asiatic enemy. He repeatedly referred to the war in the Soviet Union as a struggle of worldviews and irreconcilable ideologies. And he assured his troops that in this battle there was only victory or death, nothing in between. Schörner's style of command is perhaps best illustrated by an order he issued on the Murmansk front in 1942. He received reports that Arctic conditions were harming morale, so he simply decreed, "The Arctic does not exist." And I'm sure they didn't feel the cold after that. One of his more extreme orders came in June 1944, and again I quote, "A generation must be created that removes every bourgeois concept of human dignity and every touch of softness. We must surpass our enemies, even in ardent hatred. By the blazing flame, we vow to overcome our miraculous good-naturedness in Asiatic war, and to draw strength from the destructive fire to consume ourselves in merciless hatred for our enemies." So he didn't mince any words in his orders. Among his fellow officers and subordinates, Schörner was either greatly revered or profoundly hated, for he was an unconventional commander in several respects. German Army Group commanders usually spent most of their time at the headquarters. They're receiving reports from subordinate units and issuing orders. Not Schörner. He spent most of his time away from headquarters. His main goal appears to have been to catch soldiers doing something wrong. And he loved to terrorize soldiers behind the front lines. If you were a frontline soldier, he didn't mess with you. But behind the lines, he was awful. He enjoyed sneaking into the back doors. He'd occasionally crawl through a window of a mess hall or a field kitchen to make sure that the officers and the cooks ate the same food that was served to the troops. Woe to the soldier who tried to catch an afternoon nap, drove a little over the speed limit, or tried to loosen his collar, for these were the types of offenses he particularly sought. For reasons I will get to in a minute, General Ludwig von Notzmer emerged as Schörner's main nemesis after the war. Now, Notzmer was Schörner's right-hand man. He was the chief of the Army Group General Staff, both at Army Group North and Center, so we're talking the period July 44 till the end of the war of May 1945. This was his right-hand man. While Notzmer recognized Schörner's personal bravery and ability to restore and maintain order, he criticized him for terrorizing cooks when he should have been leading the Army Group. According to Notzmer, Schörner left the business of fighting the war to his staff while he roamed throughout the rear area, searching for soldiers guilty of minor infractions. Notzmer also claimed that although frontline soldiers enjoyed knowing that rear area troops suffered under Schörner's reign of terror, that didn't mean that they trusted him. Schörner was too mercurial, too harsh, and too unjust to win the full confidence of the soldiers in the trenches. Several commanders who served under Schörner, including Notzmer, may not have liked his methods, but they admitted that he got results. Furthermore, Schörner really did play a more active role in leading the Army Group than Notzmer concedes. Schörner reached many of his decisions to order retreats after visiting the front lines, and most 4- and 5-star generals in World War II did not get as near the front as Schörner did. But his methods were questionable at the very least. Schörner was pedantic and irritating with his micromanaging and obsession with unimportant regulations. There can be no doubt that many soldiers hated him solely because he was so annoying. Even as a general and a field marshal, he continued to concern himself with matters that are normally dealt with much, much lower ranking officers. For example, in preparation for the invasion of England, which was later called off, he simply decreed that every man had to be able to swim within 2 weeks. He repeatedly, and I mean repeatedly, issued orders limiting telephone conversations to 3 minutes, fixing the maximum speed of vehicles at 40 kilometers per hour, and that's a little less than 25 miles an hour, and criticizing soldiers for wasting wood on fires. I don't know what he expected them to do with the wood. On 3 separate occasions, he warned his troops against engaging in sexual relations with women in occupied territories, specifically in France, in Greece, and in Russia. He threatened amorous soldiers with a court-martial and inspired them with the statement that abstinence does not harm your health. Although armies do have to be concerned about STDs, this is something lieutenants and captains do, not colonels and generals. Schörner has drawn a lot of criticism for the harshness of his sentences and his enthusiasm in punishing soldiers. He posted lists of soldiers, lists of soldiers' crimes and their punishment, intending to deter others from similar misconduct. And so what he's got here is 7 people who've been sentenced to death, and only one's going to prison. So that kind of gives you an idea of how he did things. Angered that soldiers were not returning from leave on time, Schörner warned that any soldier who returned late from leave intentionally will have to spend 1 year in prison for every day late he returned. A driver in a supply unit received 6 months in prison for exceeding the speed limit. He was traveling 43 miles an hour. Another driver was sentenced to 3 weeks arrest for driving on the wrong side of the road to avoid potholes. Troops who shot reindeer, he was in the Arctic, received sentences ranging from 3 to 6 months in prison. And at times he would demand that judges in a court-martial revise their verdict. One example, a soldier had been sentenced to 4 weeks in prison for a traffic violation. Schörner demanded it be increased to 6 months. Offenses that were more grave received harsher judgment. Falling asleep on guard duty, 5 years in prison. And one soldier who supposedly allowed his face and hands to become frostbitten to avoid action at the front received the death penalty. On more than one occasion, Schörner instructed troops to fire above the heads of retreating German soldiers to try to get them to turn around. After the war, a magazine published an article in which it said that Schörner, there was a bridge that he was at, and he'd instructed troops to fire machine guns over the fleeing soldiers' heads. Schörner indignantly wrote the magazine and said he most definitely had not had machine guns fire over their heads. They were anti-aircraft guns, which are much less accurate, so this is very dangerous. Although he had a reputation for commanding through fear, especially in 1945, he ruled through absolute terror. And he undoubtedly exceeded the norms even for Nazi Germany. He was infamous for finding more combat troops by combing out soldiers from supply and support services and sending them to the trenches. He repeatedly inspected hospitals, searching for malingerers, and he dragged seriously ill soldiers from their hospital beds, some who could barely stand, and sent them off for action at the front. The most extreme of his misdeeds was the execution of many German soldiers as deserters, particularly in the war's final months. And these flying court-martials would be behind the front, and if they caught anybody not at the front, they would give them a 5-minute court-martial and either shoot them or hang them. Now, 2 former members of Schörner's staff have claimed that in order to maintain discipline, Schörner invented lists of condemned soldiers with fictitious names and offenses. This may have been true sometimes, but many of those executed were not fabricated. There were 2 legally documented cases where Schörner ordered soldiers immediate execution even before the court-martial. This was in 1945. And the diaries and memoirs of many soldiers who served under Schörner testify to the senseless execution of comrades. Soldiers and civilians alike reported seeing German soldiers of all ages, either shot or hanged, with placards around their neck proclaiming they were cowards and deserters. Now, I have just spent about 20 minutes telling you what an awful person Schörner was, and he was, but that doesn't mean that he was ineffective. Despite the generally accepted interpretation, I think that Schörner was actually a skillful commander, and he saved the lives of thousands of his troops. Furthermore, in contrast to his depiction as Hitler's toady, his yes man, Schörner repeatedly disobeyed Hitler's orders and never lost his job. It's a little more difficult to assess Schörner's talents early in the war because he was not making many decisions. He took part in the Polish and French campaign. In the French campaign, he captured 120,000 French, which was about 10 times his number. In 1941, his division broke through the Metaxas line in northern Greece. And it was Schörner's troops who first entered Athens. And you can see here's one of his soldiers racing across the Acropolis to raise the swastika over Athens. Then, certainly to his great dismay, in August 1941, here are some of the reindeer, Schörner was sent to the Arctic. German troops north of the Arctic Circle surely felt as if they were mere onlookers, unable to take part in the great German victories in the first months of the Russian campaign, when advances were made in hundreds of miles. Schörner remained in this remote theater for more than 2 years, in a sector with relatively few troops, where weather and terrain ruled out rapid movement, and with key events occurring elsewhere. Schörner probably thought that his career had literally been put on ice. His greatest accomplishment in the Arctic was to prevent the encirclement and destruction of his troops when the Soviets launched a major attack in May 1942 in a blizzard. Vehicles could not travel on roads that had disappeared under snowdrifts. And so what Schörner did was he gave all the soldiers he could round up in the rear area a pair of skis and a knapsack filled with food and ammunition, and said, go supply the front. And it worked. In October 1943, he finally left the Arctic, and Hitler sent him to the extreme southern end of the front, to the Nikopol bridgehead. Now, after the German defeat at Stalingrad, they had retreated to the Dnieper River. Hitler wanted a bridgehead on the other side of the river to protect the manganese mines. Manganese is a key element in making steel for tanks and other armored vehicles. And Hitler was always very attuned to economic imperatives of the war. And it was here that Schörner displayed two characteristics that he was to follow throughout the rest of the war. First, he insisted that his troops hold the line, and they better not retreat. But when the situation became too dangerous, and this happened in February 1944, he disobeyed Hitler's explicit written and oral commands, and he pulled all 17 divisions across the river and abandoned the manganese mines. Instead of dismissing Schörner, Hitler awarded him with the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, and shortly thereafter gave him command of Army Group South Ukraine. Now, commanding an army group for Germany consisting of several 100,000 men in 1944 and 1945 was neither a particularly easy nor a desirable task. By this time, the Russians are winning. And when Schörner commanded Army Group South Ukraine, he endured a major Soviet attack. He gave up ground, as we can see here, but he held the front intact. He did suffer a major defeat on the Crimean Peninsula due to Hitler's stubbornness, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. At the end of July 1944, Hitler sent Schörner to the other end of the Eastern Front, to Army Group North, and he took over at a very dangerous time. At the end of June, the Soviets launched a big offensive against Army Group Center and inflicted a much more serious defeat than at Stalingrad. Everybody's heard of Stalingrad, nobody's heard of Bagration. The Soviets had ripped a 100-mile hole in the front, and Schörner was sent up here, and you can see he's going to get cut off in Estonia. Schörner ignored Hitler's orders and sanctioned several major retreats involving either great distances, as when he evacuated Estonia, or strategic sites, as in the case of the Svorba Peninsula on the Baltic island of Ursel. The retreat from Estonia was a major withdrawal. From here to here was 400 kilometers, around 300 miles. That's a long ways to go. Then, to the surprise of both Schörner and Knotzper, around noon on May 7th, They received news that the surrender would go into effect at midnight the following day. Not wishing to cause panic by sending out this information by radio, the Army group invited its 3 subordinate armies to send a staff officer for important information the next day. When they arrived, and it began at 10 o'clock in the morning on May 8th, just a little more than 12 hours left in the war. The Army group issued a written order that the surrender takes place at midnight. No equipment, no weapons are to be destroyed, and when midnight comes, soldiers have to remain in place. They couldn't keep retreating towards the Americans. That was the written order. There was an oral order to break into smaller groups and have a mass flight to the west. And if you have to fight your way through, fight your way through. Okay, up to this point, there's little disagreement. But the events of the following 24 hours are hotly contested. According to Notzmer, this is why he's the nemesis, already on the evening of May 7th, Schörner approached him and informed him he would be leaving. His escape had been prepared, and he was too important to be captured. He then opened a briefcase full of cash and offered Notzmer some to fund his escape. Notzmer refused and insisted that Schörner remain with his men. Furthermore, there was only one small command aircraft. Notzmer said he needed it to be in touch with the subordinate units because radio communications were unreliable. Schörner angrily refused, telling Notzmer, "Lead the army on as best you can." And he sent an orderly out to find some civilian clothes for him. Early on the morning of May 9th, he boarded the plane and flew away. That's Notzmer's version. Schörner vehemently disagrees with this version. He insists that on his last visit to Hitler's headquarters, his bunker in Berlin, on April 23rd, Hitler gave him a secret mission to take command of the Alpine Fortress, also known as the National Redoubt. Schörner also insists that on May 8th he turned over command of the Army group to a General von Hesse, who was the commander of 17th Army. So to Schörner, when he left on the 9th of May, he was following Hitler's order after turning over command of the Army group. Furthermore, the terms of the surrender forbade any command activity. And Schörner said, well, if I can't lead, why should I just sit here and be captured by the Russians? Now, there are former German officers who support both viewpoints. But by this point, Hitler had been dead for over a week. And if Schörner recognized that the war was over, why is he going to lead soldiers somewhere else? And the Alpine Fortress was really more fiction than reality in any event. Schörner's response to these charges was that there were rumors and there was some evidence that the British and Americans were going to begin to recruit German soldiers to fight the Russians. And Schörner viewed the Alpine Fortress as a rallying point for German troops. But the fact remains that a commander who had executed hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers for cowardice ran away when faced with imminent capture. For many, this was a stain darker than his harsh command methods, and for this reason, he was denied a pension when he was not only a brute to his soldiers. As a young officer in the general staff, he had a reputation of being rude even to the secretaries. He liked to play cards, at which he cheated. And again, a quote, and he drew a childish delight in doing so, winning a few pennies off his subordinates who could not challenge him. So how does learning about someone like this further our understanding of Nazi Germany in World War II? In the first place, it tells you something about the limits of obedience and disobedience in the Third Reich. The standard interpretation is that Hitler never permitted retreats, and if a general did retreat, he would be fired and replaced with someone else. This is clearly not the case with Schörner. On several occasions, he disobeyed Hitler's explicit orders, but suffered no consequences. Why was this the case with Schörner, but not with so many other generals? I think there are several reasons. For one thing, Schörner was from Munich. Hitler liked Munich. When he moved to Germany in 1913, he settled in Munich. He kept his apartment there until his death. Munich was the birthplace and always considered the home of the Nazi movement. His secretary, Traudl Junge, was convinced that she got the job primarily because she was from Munich, and Hitler liked to be around people from Munich. A second reason was Schörner's lower middle class background. Unlike many high-ranking German officers, Schörner was not a noble or from a wealthy family. Hitler felt uncomfortable around aristocratic officers. He sensed they looked down upon him, and they did. Schörner felt the same way, and this was something the two had in common. Hitler also liked commanders who had risen through the ranks and were tough. By the time Schörner reached a high level of command, Hitler needed tough generals who would hold the line and not constantly be asking for retreats. In the final year of the war, Hitler wanted generals to fight. Schörner represented a new and a different type of German general who believed that determination and an iron will could accomplish much. I think all these reasons play a role, but what Schörner possessed that no other army general possessed, at least to the degree, was unreserved support for National Socialist ideology and personal loyalty to Hitler. Hitler had created National Socialism and took its ideas very seriously. They were his ideas. Many commanders had no interest in ideology. Some paid lip service but were really unconcerned. Schörner was a true believer. Hitler recognized this and felt he could trust Schörner, and Schörner skillfully used this to his advantage. He learned from his experiences with Hitler, especially dealing with retreats. He couldn't always convince Hitler. And one particular example is the Crimea, here on the Black Sea. In late 1943, the Russians had come across here and cut off German troops in the Crimea. Schörner repeatedly asked that they be evacuated. But Hitler said the Crimea was of the utmost importance for control of the Black Sea, as well as for diplomatic relations with Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. So he refused. Then the Russians attacked in April, and by the end of April, the Germans just have a little tiny area around the port of Sevastopol. This is when Schörner decided to seek a decision. Now, Hitler often accused commanders of being out of touch with the real situation at the front. And so Schörner took 3 frontline commanders with him. And on the flight to Hitler's headquarters, he said, okay, present the situation in your sector realistically, but you need to support my proposal for an evacuation. During the situation conference, Schörner informed Hitler that the evacuation was urgent and must be done immediately. The 3 commanders presented their reports. And then upon the conclusion of their presentations, Hitler looked each one in the eye and asked them the same question. And you, sir, will you still beat back all Russian attacks with your brave men and hold your positions to the last man? All 3 answered, Jawohl, mein Führer. Schörner was probably ready to rip his hair out. That was not what they were supposed to do. But such was Hitler's charisma. Hitler turned to Schörner and said, evacuation's out of the question. 2 weeks later, Hitler finally approved, but the Russians had taken more territory and they were able to disrupt the loading of troops on ships, and over 25,000 German and Romanian troops were captured senselessly. The second example is that withdrawal from Estonia in September 1944. Schörner went to Hitler's headquarters. He had this beautiful map with all these lines on it and began to explain to Hitler how when we withdraw here, we're going to free up this many divisions to use somewhere else, and then here there'll be more. Hitler reached into a bowl of colored pencils and held them over the map. And the person who described it said he held it over the map menacingly, but didn't say a word. Schörner didn't quite know what was going on. He continued giving the report, and finally he was so unnerved that he swept the map off the table and said, all right, we'll hold our present positions. Hitler put the pencils back into the bowl and said, I knew I could rely on you, Schörner. A week later, Schörner ordered the evacuation of Estonia anyway. And from this and the example of the Crimea, I think that Schörner learned how to manage Hitler. If you show up in person and make a proposal for a retreat, if Hitler doesn't go for it, just stop. And what he began to do was to defy Hitler from a distance. He would wait until the last possible moment. He was very good at gauging the last possible moment. Then he would order the retreat on his own authority and phone Hitler and tell him. He was never fired. And what this shows you is that to some degree Hitler could be managed. And in 1945, I don't know of any other general that could manage Hitler. A final reason to understand how the Germans were able to resist so many countries for so long. Even when it was blatantly obvious Germany had lost the war, is again, Schörner's methods were effective. They were brutal, but effective. After the war, a Russian remarked to a member of Hitler's entourage, if Hitler had a dozen Schörners, you would have had a chance. Soviet Commander Marshal Kunev reportedly said that without Schörner, the Red Army would have ended the war on the Rhine. Many stories of Schörner's excesses are invented, and Notzber recognized this and admitted that fear of Schörner was a powerful motivator. But they were not all fabrications. There are so many Schörner tales by so many people that there has to be some truth to them. Schörner was at best an extremely unpleasant person and more likely a brutal murderer. But this is the general that Hitler liked best, and it tells us something about Hitler as well. Thank you.